up, biology students? Mr. Holloway here. In today's video, we're going to talk about how the process of evolution can produce new species over time, a phenomenon called speciation. We know that the species inhabiting Earth today haven't always been here. The fossil record tells us this is so. We also know that certain species that existed in the past do not exist anymore today, a phenomenon that we call extinction. The power of evolution as an explanatory theory is that it can explain the origin of species, the origin of biodiversity on planet Earth. Basically, this theory explains where new species come from, but it also tells us why certain species go extinct while others persist in time. In our previous videos, we've seen examples of species changing over time, but what about new species? Where do new species come from? When a new species is formed, we call that speciation. And according to Charles Darwin, new species originate by means of natural selection. So the same process that causes species to change over generations can, if allowed to go on long enough, eventually produce new species. But what exactly is a species, and what are our criteria for deciding and distinguishing between species? A species, in a general sense, is a specific kind of organism. A rose is a specific kind of flower, a lion is a specific kind of cat, and a grizzly bear is a specific kind of bear. This idea has been around for a long time. In 1735, Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus wrote a book called Systema Naturae, which was an attempt to classify all the different kinds of plants and animals. This book established a system for naming and classifying living organisms into categories. Linnaeus recommended classifying organisms into different categories, and these categories come in different levels, from very broad to very specific. The broadest category, according to the Linnaean system, is the kingdom. The animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the fungi kingdom, for example. In our figure here, we are looking at a few representatives of the animal kingdom, from sea stars to grizzly bears. Within each kingdom are several phyla. The phylum we are looking at in this figure is the Chordata phylum, all members of the animal kingdom who have a spinal cord. So that includes all these animals, but not the sea star, which is an invertebrate without a spinal cord. Class is the next level, and in this figure we're looking at the class Mammalia, all the chordates that are mammals, warm-blooded and with fur. So that includes all these animals, but not the snake, which would belong to the class Reptilia. Next is order. In this case, Carnivora. All the mammals that are carnivores, which includes all these animals but not the squirrel. Then we have the family Ursidae, all the bear-like organisms. These three, but not the fox. Then we come to the genus level, Ursus in this case. The genus Ursus includes all the true bears, black bears and brown bears. Last is the species, the specific kind of organism we are looking at, which in this case is a grizzly bear. When naming an organism, we would first classify it according to this system. When talking about or describing this organism, we use both its genus and species name. So the grizzly bear is called Ursus arctos. A single species is generally, but not always, made up of multiple populations. In our modern-day view of biology, we even have subspecies, which are an even more specific group. It is generally accepted that members of the same species are able to breed and produce fertile offspring, which means that different subspecies and different populations would be able to breed and produce offspring who are also capable of producing offspring, as long as they are all members of the same species. But different species, even within the same genus, are usually not able to breed in a manner that produces fertile offspring. Horses and donkeys are different species, and they are able to breed, but their offspring, animals we call mules, are sterile and are unable to breed themselves. Mules are an evolutionary dead end because two mules cannot mate and produce another mule. This idea is called the biological species concept, and it is the most commonly accepted definition of what makes a species. Speciation, or the formation of a new species, can happen under a variety of conditions. The most common forms of speciation are allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is when speciation occurs due to physical barriers that separate part of a population from the rest of the population. In this case, a river has divided our population, and the trees on one side of the gorge evolve into a new species slowly over many generations. Differences in environmental conditions, even subtle ones, result in different selective pressures on either side of the gorge. Since natural selection would favor slightly different traits and abilities in each environment, trees in these environments would evolve differently. But what makes it allopatric speciation is that these two populations are completely separated from one another. They can't get to one another. Sympatric speciation, on the other hand, is when speciation occurs within a population, no separation necessary. In this case, a new species of tree evolved within the old population. Usually, this kind of speciation occurs when two very different sets of traits each hold a survival advantage. In this case, perhaps, hypothetically, trees that grow taller and narrower have high fitness, and trees that grow shorter and wider also have high fitness, while trees that are somewhere in between have lower fitness. Over time, natural selection would cause a divergence from one population and one species into two populations and two species living side by side and basically among each other. One species of tall, narrow trees and one population of short, wide trees. In either case, whether we're talking about allopatric or sympatric speciation, one thing must happen in order for speciation to occur: reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is when there is no longer any interbreeding between members of two populations. This means that the gene pools of these two populations are also isolated, and no alleles are moving back and forth between populations any longer. In allopatric speciation, this would occur primarily due to the geographic barrier. In the past, all these trees used to interbreed, and the genes were passed around through sexual reproduction, because all these trees are members of the same gene pool. However, after this barrier split the population, these two populations have separate gene pools, and over time, isolated gene pools diverge into new and separate species. Here we see a list of what are called prezygotic isolating mechanisms. Prezygotic meaning before a zygote can form, which means that these mechanisms prevent fertilization from occurring. Geographic isolation, when species occur in different areas separated by a physical barrier, such as a river or mountain range, is one form of prezygotic reproductive isolation, and results in allopatric speciation. But reproductive isolation can happen in other ways too, which explains why sympatric speciation is possible. Ecological isolation is when species occur in the same area, but they occupy different habitats or niches and rarely encounter each other as a result. For example, lizards living in the same area, some lizards living in the trees and some living on the ground. Lizards living in trees would rarely if ever encounter a lizard living on the ground, and consequently, these lizards would never interbreed. Temporal isolation is when species live in the same area but reproduce in different seasons or at different times of day. For example, flowers living in the same area, and some of these flowers reproduce in spring, while others reproduce in summer. They would never interbreed. Or maybe frogs, some of whom reproduce at dusk, while others reproduce at dawn. They would also never interbreed. Behavioral isolation is when species differ in their mating rituals. For example, birds with different mating calls. If certain females prefer certain calls, while certain other kinds of females prefer the other kind of call, eventually these two populations might diverge from one another. Mechanical isolation is when structural differences prevent mating between certain individuals. Reproductive isolation could also occur if the gametes of certain individuals are just not well suited for the gametes of certain other individuals. This would prevent fertilization from occurring even if these incompatible individuals did attempt to mate with one another. As was the case with mechanical isolation, individuals would have to already be pretty different for this sort of thing to occur, meaning that the two groups have probably been reproductively isolated in other ways for a while. Postzygotic isolating mechanisms are those that prevent hybridization between two groups even when they are able to interbreed, hence postzygotic or after zygote formation. Fertilization does occur, but for a variety of reasons the resulting offspring cannot breed itself, or is simply inviable. The horse plus donkey equals mule example is one example of a postzygotic isolating mechanism. Horses and donkeys can interbreed and do produce offspring, but the mule that is produced is sterile and cannot produce offspring itself. If you can't breed, you're not really part of the gene pool in an evolutionary sense, because if you can't breed, you can never pass on your alleles. So the mule produced by a horse and donkey does not contribute to any gene pool, and effectively the gene pools of horses and donkeys remain separate. In all these cases, two groups are reproductively isolated, even though they live in close proximity, effectively meaning that these two groups have two separate gene pools. These gene pools are likely to evolve differently over time because there are so many different ways to be fit in any particular environment, and traits that are beneficial in one group may be slightly different than the traits that are beneficial in the other group. Let's take a look at a few examples, or case studies in speciation. One case is that of the kaibab squirrel and the Abert squirrel. The Abert squirrel lives in environments ranging from Colorado to New Mexico to Arizona, but their population stops at the south rim of the Grand Canyon. On the north rim of the Grand Canyon, there is a population of squirrels that look very similar to the Abert squirrels in many ways. Its dark-colored fur and its tufted ears in particular. This is the kaibab squirrel, and it is currently classified as a subspecies of Abert squirrel. This means that it is very likely that if an Abert squirrel were to breed with a kaibab squirrel, the two would probably be able to produce fertile offspring. But these groups are reproductively isolated from one another by the vast expanse that is the Grand Canyon. The environmental conditions on the north rim of the Grand Canyon are pretty different from those on the south rim, and that means that these two groups are subject to different selective pressures. Over time, this means that natural selection will cause these two groups to evolve differently, and is likely to result in speciation at some point in the future. This would be an example of allopatric speciation, because it would occur due to a physical barrier, the Grand Canyon in this case, that geographically isolates these two groups and prevents them from being able to interbreed. Another interesting case of speciation in action is one occurring in the many subspecies of salamanders that inhabit the west coast of the United States. This map shows the geographic range of several subspecies of salamanders of the species Encentina eschscholtzii. The ancestors of all these different subspecies occupied the Pacific Northwest, and members of this species have slowly been migrating southward for quite some time. Salamanders are amphibians, and their breathing requires their skin to stay moist and cool. So as they moved southward, the salamanders stick to the mountainous regions, the coastal range, and the Sierra Nevadas, avoiding the central deserts of California. If we look at different populations of salamanders in different parts of California, we notice a sort of transition in terms of appearance as we go from north to south. We should also notice that this transition occurs differently in the coastal range compared to the Sierra Nevadas. Studies have indicated that the fitness of salamanders along the Sierra Nevadas is based largely on their ability to remain camouflaged among the leaf litter on the ground. They avoid predators by blending in, and blending in is their primary adaptation. However, salamanders living along the coastal range, who happen to look a lot like a species of poisonous newt, are taking a different evolutionary path. Their fitness is due to mimicry. Looking like something poisonous means that predators are likely to avoid these salamanders. And unlike the salamanders in the Sierra Nevadas, mimicry is the primary adaptation of these subspecies. It's important to note, however, that all of these different subspecies share a common ancestor, one that probably looked a lot like this one here. And this is an example of how different traits in different environments can provide the same level of fitness. In one group, the ability to mimic a poisonous species, and in the other, the ability to blend in. And over time, that is causing these two groups of amphibians to become increasingly different from one another. Genetically, these subspecies are reproductively compatible, and there are still places where the camouflage salamanders and the mimicry salamanders interbreed. On our map here, these are referred to as zones of hybridization, because different subspecies of salamanders are able to hybridize with one another due to their overlapping ranges. However, even though hybridization between coastal salamanders and those living in the Sierra Nevadas is possible in a few places, and even though these subspecies are able to produce viable offspring, the offspring have reduced fitness compared to their parents, because they are not very well camouflaged and they don't look very much like the poisonous species of newt. So these hybrid offspring are far less likely to survive to produce offspring themselves. These subspecies are in the process of becoming reproductively isolated from one another, and separate, isolated gene pools are being established. This is a key step in the process of speciation, and it's happening right now in California as we speak. Another example of speciation is a classic example, one whose results Darwin was able to observe when he traveled to the Galapagos. These are Darwin's finches, and today they look differently and occupy different niches on different islands in the Galapagos. But if we look far enough back in time, we would find that they all shared a common ancestor, one who originally flew to the Galapagos from South America. As this population of finches became established in the Galapagos, it expanded its range and spread to new environments on new islands. These island populations were reproductively isolated because finches were far more likely to mate with finches that lived on the same island than to mate with finches that lived on a different island. Although they are relatively close together, the Galapagos Islands have pretty different environmental conditions. Some islands are very wet with lush vegetation, while other islands are drier and almost desert-like in some regions. This means that each island has its own unique set of selective pressures, and even within a single island there are regions with different selective pressures due to the mountainous topography. As finches moved into new environments, different traits turned out to be useful on different islands. Some islands favored the large beaks that helped to crack open the larger seeds available, while other islands favored the smaller beaks that were better at picking up smaller seeds. Still other finches were able to get by eating insects, and this practice was made easier if those finches happened to have a slightly different beak configuration that made it a little bit easier to catch insects. Since these populations are reproductively isolated from one another, their gene pools began to change and diverge from one another over time. This led to numerous instances of speciation, and today there are many different species of finches living in the Galapagos. This is called an adaptive radiation because one ancestral group gave rise to many different species due to many different adaptive pathways that turned out to be useful in this new environment. All these different species of finches share a common ancestor, one that established the original population of finches that lived in the Galapagos long before Darwin arrived there on the HMS Beagle. But depending on where these finches lived and what they ate, different genes turned out to be useful, and natural selection produced different results. But in all cases, the finches were able to adapt to their environment on each island over generations, as the individual finches with the least favorable traits were negatively affected by natural selection, while the finches with the most favorable traits thrived. Speciation occurs at different rates depending on how slowly or rapidly the environment changes. When the environment changes slowly but steadily over time, this produces a pattern of evolution called gradualism, characterized by a gradual but persistent pattern of change in a lineage of living organisms. As speciation occurs, one species sort of fades into the next, and it can be difficult to know where to draw the lines between one species and the next. This is a lot like what's happening with our salamanders in California. When the environment changes quickly, then remains stable for long periods of time before changing quickly again, this produces a pattern of evolution called punctuated equilibrium. Rapid bursts of evolution followed by long periods of stability and equilibrium. Both patterns of change are indicated frequently in the fossil record here on planet Earth, depending on what happened to be going on in the environment at the time. Regardless of whether it happens rapidly or very, very slowly, evolution produces biodiversity. Speciation is when populations of similar organisms diverge from one another due to reproductive isolation, and as each line is subject to different pressures exerted by natural selection, they evolve differently and form new species over time. Evolution is the process that has produced the tree of life we see here on this screen, and it is a process that has been at work since the origin of life on our planet, and which continues to this very day. Evolution explains how species adapt to become well-suited for their environments, even as the environments themselves change over time. And evolution explains why some species go extinct and cease to exist when they cannot cope with these changes. Everything we've learned about in biology, every biological structure, and every biological function is the product of millions, even billions of years of evolution, and understanding the evolutionary process helps us to better understand these structures and these functions. And with that, I will bring our video to a close. Thanks for watching, and remember, you can go back and watch this video as many times as you need until you feel like you understand the concept of speciation and how natural selection over many, many generations can result in this process.